Welcome to meeting number 44 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Today, we will continue our study of the conditions faced by the asylum seekers. I confirm that all witnesses have conducted the required technical tests in preparation for this meeting. To begin, before we go into the witnesses for today, I would like to confirm that the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration is prepared to appear on Tuesday, November 29th, on the Supplementary Estimates B and Canada's Immigration Level Plan 2023-2025. So the Tuesday meeting will be with the Minister. So just wanted to confirm with everyone. On December 2nd, we will have our final panel on conditions faced by asylum seekers, and then a subcommittee meeting to discuss the future business as requested by the members in the last meeting. On December 6th, we are planning to begin our study on the government response on the final report of the Special Committee on Afghanistan. On Friday, December 9th, we will provide drafting instructions for conditions faced by the asylum seekers.
Madam Chair?
And yes, Mr. Reddycop.
Just want to circle back to the Minister's appearance next week. We had asked him to come to talk about the SUP-Bs. We do intend to ask him to come to talk about the immigration plan again, but those will be two separate things. That was not what we wanted for. We just want the SUP-Bs on Tuesday. Thank you.
This is the information I received, that he is willing to appear and he's prepared to talk on both of them, supplementary estimates and the Canada's immigration level plans. That's the information which we received from his office.
Okay, well you can just circle back with him and let him know that we'll be calling him again for the plan as well. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Kwan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to reiterate that point, the committee has passed two motions. One is to invite the minister to come for the supplementary estimates, and the other one is to invite the minister separately for the levels plan. So there's two separate invitations. I appreciate that he can come and talk to all things of all manner, which I'm sure committee members would appreciate. But that said, there are two separate invites, and we should make sure that he understands that, and for the clerk to extend an additional invite for the levels plan.
Thank you. Mr. Brunel Giuseppe and then Ms. Lalonde. Sorry, I can't see everyone, so I'm just relying on the information I'm getting from the clerk.
Non, merci Madame la Présidente. Non, c'est bon, Jenny vient de faire le point là, que je voulais faire. Donc, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Jenny just made the point that I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lalonde.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais juste enlever.
Thank you very much. I will just take off my earpiece for interpretation. So I just wanted to say that I appreciate the comments. I don't think it's up to us, though, to decide what the minister will want to say. So I was happy to see that he wanted to participate and come meet with us. So I don't think it is up to us to decide what he is going to say. It will be up to him to come to this committee, and I am a little bit surprised at what my colleagues are saying. We know that the minister wants to make himself available, and I was very proud to see that he was committed to coming here to talk to us about things that concern us all with regard to immigration plans. So I think it's very generous on his part, and I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair. Yes, Mr. Brunel Giuseppe. Yes, I understand that the Liberal caucus is proud of having the minister here. I mean, but when you call him generous, well, he's not the Pope exactly, and I think that that's part of his job. And so, really, we just have to respect the will of the committee. We decided that we wanted him to come here, and we are sovereign in our decisions. But I'm happy that you're proud. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brunel Giuseppe. Okay, I'll raise this and then get back to you as I get some more information. So With that, just want to inform that we will have few minutes in the end to go through the committee business about the issue which we put it for Friday on the last Tuesday. Now we can go into our witnesses. I would like to welcome all the witnesses for appearing before this committee today. Today we are joined by the Immigration and Refugee Board, being represented by Mr. Richard Vax, Chairperson and Chief Executive Officer, Raula Itrides, Deputy Chairperson, Refugee Protection Division, and Gary Dukeshire, Senior Counsel. We are also joined by Canada Border Services Agency, being represented by Arun McCrory, Vice President, Intelligence and Enforcement, and also Carl Desmarais, Director General Enforcement. Our third witness for today is Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Michelle Duhem, Deputy Commissioner, and Superintendent Martin Roach, Acting Criminal Operations Officer, C Division. Welcome to all the witnesses. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. We will begin with the Immigration and Refugee Board. Please begin, welcome, and you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you mentioned, I'm joined today by Ms. Raula Itrides, Deputy Chairperson of the Refugee Protection Division, and Gary Dukeshire, our Senior Counsel. I know the committee is particularly interested in IRB's refugee claims inventory and wait times and projections, so I'll get right to the point and dispense with the usual introductions about our role and mandate in the context of the asylum system. I assume you're well briefed on that. Lorsque je me suis présenté devant
When I came here the first time as the President of the Commission in 2018, we were faced with an operational context that was very difficult.
Both regular and irregular had far outstripped the IRB's annual processing capacity, leading to the largest backlog and the longest wait times in the board's 30-year history. At the time, our assessment was that without interventions, the backlog would reach well over 200,000 claims, with wait times in excess of 6 years for a first-level refugee determination by 22-23. The system, in our view at that time, was on the brink of collapse. As a result, in 1819, the IRB responded with developing an ambitious growth and transformation agenda. Now
into our fourth year of our plan, I would like to share some key results and give you a sense of the challenges ahead. First, let me talk about growth.
The board received significant temporary investments by way of successive federal budgets, which allowed us to effectively double our decision-making output and better align IRB's annual processing capacity with the refugee claim intake. This was a massive scaling up in a relatively short amount of time for our organization. This growth, coupled with internal efficiencies and the pandemic-related border restrictions, led to improved access to justice for those existing claimants in our inventory, as measured both by the number of claims adjudicated and a reduction in wait times. Most recently, Budget 2022 announced that the funds previously provided in recent budgets to the IRB on a temporary basis will be made permanent, and that the IRB will also receive additional funds over 2 years to process additional claims. Sous réserve de l'approbation du Parlement,
those funds will make it possible to stabilize the organization at the current levels and to allow us to continue to grow to better meet increasing intake volumes.
Transformation agenda, we've implemented a range of measures to improve both the efficiency and the quality of our decision-making. L'un des volets du programme.
One area I would like to highlight is our hearings operating model. The board sees the opportunities presented by the pandemic to become a digital organization.
2021, during the height of the pandemic, the board moved to a paperless and virtual hearings operating model. All files have since been digitized. Adjudicators now work almost entirely with digital files. An electronic portal has been built and is well adopted by the council community, and over 98% of our hearings are now held virtually. Moving to a virtual hearings operating posture allowed the board to both protect the health of our employees and those appearing before the board while maintaining access to justice during the toughest days of the pandemic. It was key to keeping our inventories and our wait times in check. In fact, according to the latest UNHCR Global Trends report, Canada was one of only 4 countries over the previous year that was able to significantly reduce its inventory of asylum cases at the refugee determination stage during the pandemic.
Thanks to new investments and new measures introduced under our Growth and Transformation Plan, both the Refugee Protection Division and the Refugee Appeal Division finalized more claims and appeals last year than ever before.
When I first appeared at this committee in this capacity, in this very room, wait times were at 2 years and growing at a pace not previously seen. Today, wait times for new claimants are at 16 months, down 25% from where they were in 18-19 and down almost 30% from their peak in the spring of 2020. At the end of Q1 of this fiscal year, wait times at the IRB were at their lowest since 16-17, prior to the unprecedented influx of claimants. Given the operating context over the last few years, by any measure, these are solid results. Despite these positive developments at the IRB, I do need to be very clear. The tide has now clearly turned. The IRB and certainly the asylum system as a whole are once again under real strain. As you've heard, the pending eligibility inventory at IRCC and CBSA is growing quickly. Their intake this year is projected to be some 90,000 plus claims, well beyond the system's and IRB's annual processing capacity of up to 50,000. Referrals to the board are now outpacing our annual processing capacity, leading once again to growing inventories and wait times, reversing hard-won gains. Par conséquent,
as a result, everyone must redouble their efforts to advance system-wide efficiencies and funding strategies to deal with these realities, improve access to justice, and better support Canada's refugee determination system.
Rula will answer all your questions.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up. We will now proceed to Canada Border Service Agency. You will have 5 minutes, and you can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. Bonjour. I'm Aaron McCrory, the Vice President of Intelligence and Enforcement at the Canada Border Service Agency, or CBSA, and I'm joined today by my colleague Carl Desmarais, the Director General of Enforcement at CBSA. J'aimerais parler brièvement.
I would like to tell you about the role of our agency when it comes to asylum seekers, particularly irregular arrivals, most of whom come through Roxham Road. Integrity at the border is a shared mandate between CBSA and the RCMP.
Legislation at designated ports of entry. The RCMP is responsible for enforcing law between ports of entry. When a refugee claimant enters Canada to make an asylum claim, the CBS role is to determine that person's admissibility into Canada and the eligibility of their claim under the Immigration, Refugee and Protection Act, or IRPA. To date, in 2022, the CBSA has received over 2,400 regular refugee claims, most of which are received by claimants arriving by air. In comparison, this year, the CBSA has received over 32,000 irregular arrivals. Of those, more than 97% are in the province of Quebec. Most irregular arrivals are crossing the Canada-U.S. border at Roxham Road. It is not an official border crossing. Under the Safe Third Country Agreement, people seeking refugee protection must make a claim in the first country they arrive in this case either in Canada or the U.S., unless they qualify for an exception. This agreement applies to those making refugee claimants at designated ports of entry, but does not apply to asylum seekers entering Canada outside of official border crossings. Par conséquent, à moins qu'il aille une...
That means that unless there is an already existing eligibility, the CBSA cannot refuse asylum seekers who come into the country from the United States through Roxham Road.
Entering between official ports of entry, the person is brought to the nearest port of entry to make a refugee claim. In this case, the nearest port of entry to Roxham Road is St. Bernard de la Colle. Before refugee claimants can leave the port of entry, they first undergo robust health and security screening. This includes biographic and biometric checks, as well as the initiation of security and criminality checks. La ASFC s'engage à traiter.
The CBSA is committed to processing all refugee claims as efficiently and quickly as possible, but the time that it takes depends on a number of things, such as the details provided by the claimant, the availability of additional information, and whether or not there's more research needed. Security, filtering, or screening is incredibly important in the process of allowing someone into Canada, and that makes it possible to ensure that a person wanting to enter Canada has not committed any serious crimes and does not create a risk for the safety of Canadians and Canada.
Several factors are used to determine an individual's admissibility, such as participation in criminal activities, human rights violations, and organized crime activities. Besides admissibility, CBSA officers must decide if a claim is eligible to be referred to the IRB for a hearing. Factors that determine a claimant's eligibility include whether the claimant has committed a serious crime, made a previous claim in Canada, or if they received protection previously in another country. To ensure refugee claimants from Roxham Road have a safe, comfortable, and appropriate waiting space while their claim is processed, the CBSA invested in short-term accommodations. We ensure that claimants have access to beds, showers, meals, and medical care if required while they're being processed. These are at the Regional Processing Centre near Saint Bernard de la Colle Port of Entry. In light of the unprecedented demands in this area, this is the only CBSA office in Canada that uses temporary structures to accommodate refugee claimants. Madam Chair, the CBSA encourages refugee claimants to enter Canada at designated points of entry. This is to ensure their personal safety as well as out of respect for the law. However, the number of irregular arrivals continues to increase. As I've already noted, since January 1st, the CBSA processed over 32,000 irregular arrivals in Quebec, mostly at the Roxham Road crossing. We are working very hard to address this surge in volumes, including the reallocation of resources from other regions to support our colleagues in Quebec, sharing local workload with Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, and creating a digital portal. In addition, to help speed up processing times, the CBSA began a new refugee process for low-risk claimants on November 1st. This process allows applicants to be admitted to Canada under conditions during which time they can access social benefits and a work permit. Applicants are then guided to the Canadian Refugee Protection Portal to complete their refugee claim within 45 days. Que la demandeuse d'asile choisit de présenter.
Whether refugee claimants present their request at a designated entry point or not, the CBSA provides its services with compassion.
Working with you to improve our refugee processing center. Nous sommes impatients de répondre.
We will be pleased to answer your questions and to work with you to improve our refugee processing system. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCrory. Now we will proceed to Royal Canadian Mounted Police. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. You can please begin.
Madam Chair, committee members, good afternoon. My name is Mike Duhaime. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for Federal Policing in the RCMP. I'm accompanied here with Monsieur Martin Roach, who oversees and manages the situation on Roxham Road. And today we will speak about the RCMP's law enforcement activities at the border. Canada, like other Western countries, is faced with the task of managing increasing irregular migration flows, which involves addressing humanitarian needs while also ensuring that those who could pose a public safety or security threat are not admitted into Canada. Personne ne mettra en doute que
There is no doubt that the illegal movement of people between ports of entry, particularly smuggling of asylum seekers over the border, is an ongoing problem. But at the heart of that problem, there are vulnerable people, refugees and asylum seekers who are often taking a long, dangerous path to arrive in Canada, and they go through the hands of transnational criminal organizations that are known for their violence and their criminal activity. That is why the RCMP is working very hard to find a balance so that it can ensure the security of Canada, but ensure at the same time that the refugees and asylum claimants are treated with compassion and have access to the law.
On the RCMP's approach to enforcing the law at the border to clarify how and when the RCMP's interaction with individuals take place. With respect to Canadian law, anyone found crossing the Canadian border without reporting at an official port of entry may be arrested by the RCMP. That said, when an individual is intercepted by the RCMP entering illegally between the ports of entry, they are arrested under Section 11-1 of the Customs Act, but their intentions are not immediately known. As such, a preliminary risk assessment is conducted to determine if there is any threat posed to Canada or Canadians. Background checks are undertaken to see if there has been any prior involvement in illegal activities, including, for example, drug trafficking, connections to organized crime, or links to terrorism. Each situation is assessed individually before a determination is made on how to proceed, whether an individual should remain in RCMP custody pending further investigation, or be referred to another police service or jurisdiction, or be transferred to CBSA for the asylum claim to be assessed. It is the totality of the information obtained by the RCMP through a preliminary risk assessment, database search, and personal documents reviewed that it is utilized to make the assessment and risk of individuals may pose. It is important to note that the RCMP does not charge those intercepted who are attempting to enter Canada to make an asylum claim, as this would be in contravention with Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which states that the individual may not be charged with certain offenses related to their illegal entry while the refugee's claim is being processed.
With regard to Roxham Road, the RCMP has its border integrity model that sends teams into the region where there is the most activity so that we can apprehend the highest number of refugee claimants that are entering between official ports of entry. And the highest number is in Quebec at Roxham Road. In 2017, between 2017 and 2021, about 95% of RCMP interceptions of persons took place there. Everyone who is stopped by the RCMP at Roxham Road is examined by the RCMP before deciding what to do.
Discharge the RCMP's mandate to protect the integrity of our borders. Our members ensure that these processes are undertaken with humanity and compassion, respecting the rights of irregular migrants and their human dignity. In order to ensure that balance is met, Canada's approach has been and continues to be examined by United Nations High Commissioner of Refugee in Canada. In the spirit of transparency, the RCMP in Quebec has facilitated several visits and offered briefings to UNHCRC. We are proud of the fact that the RCMP resources on the ground are doing the job that they are mandated to do, and they're doing it in a professional and exemplary fashion.
That being said, the RCMP wants to continually improve its activities when it comes to law enforcement at the border. A coordinated approach to border management is essential to long-term success and will make it possible for the RCMP to reach its various operational goals, such as stopping trans-border traffic of drugs and weapons and stopping the illegal smuggling of persons.
Our international partners, our national partners, such as CBSA, the IRC, to continue implementing this approach while prioritizing the safety of Canada and Canadians, ensuring the compassionate treatment of irregular migrants. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak on these important issues. I'm now happy to take any questions. Merci.
Thank you. We will now proceed to our round of questioning, and we will begin with Mr. Redekop. Mr. Redekop, you will have 6 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today, and thanks for all the important work that you're doing with migrants and newcomers to our country. It's great work that you do. I want to start with the RCMP. As you know, Quebec has its own police force, so the RCMP is focused on drug awareness, organized crime, national security, those types of things, and of course, border law enforcement. Can you please tell the committee, and if you don't know the answers to these, please submit it in writing within a fairly short time. We have a report to do, so maybe 7 days would be helpful. How many members make up the C division of the RCMP?
About 700 to 800 altogether in the division.
And how many members are currently assigned to border enforcement in total?
Madam President, probably around, give and take, depending on pressure, probably around 120 or so.
Okay. And of those 120, how many of those are at Roxham Road?
The 120, the vast majority of them would be at Roxham and concentrated. Okay, so they patrol the border. There's other pressures along the border, but 90%. I would say 90%.
Okay. What did the officers actually do at the border crossing?
Sorry?
What did the officers actually do at Roxham Road?
Well, they're at Roxham Road. They're there to, our mandate for the RCMP is to ensure that there's no national security risk, there's no links to organized crime, transnational criminality. So their presence is, and then we do have individuals that will cross the border that may present a risk for the country or may attempt to commit a crime, they'll be arresting the individual under the Customs Act. They'll be conducting the initial background checks, conducting interviews of the individuals, make sure there's no risk to the country or national security risk. And if there's no elements of criminality, then they'll be transferred over to CBSA. And that work is done in cooperation with our American partners and obviously CBSA and the national partners as well.
Time frame does that involve from intercepting a person to handing them over to the CBSA? Are we talking hours, days, weeks?
We're within our mandate, and if we were to lay charges, if somebody committed an offense and we were to lay charges, we have to do it within 24 hours. So that process, all our process is in place to make sure that we respect those 24 hours as per legislation, and then so. In terms of time frame, it varies depending on the workflows. Sometimes it's been prolonged hours, like 18 hours, because of the volumes that were coming through. But we ensure that we put the amount of resources and we adapt our process to respect the legislation.
So just so I'm clear, your piece of this takes a day or 2 days, that kind of a time frame.
Yeah, it does, but it ebbs and flows. If someone comes with a lot of personal belongings that we have to go through and assess, confirm the identity, it ebbs and flows as to, it varies. Okay. So to put a specific time, it's difficult, but again, as Martin said, our role is that first contact with the person is under the RCMP.
Fair enough. So those members who are at Roxham Road, could they be used for other activities such as counterterrorism or organized crime if they weren't being used at Roxham Road?
So some of them, yeah, and some of them actually were part of those units that we had to mobilize to the priority that was in Quebec, Roxham Road, to increase our capacity.
So, and I'm going to assume that you don't have excess manpower in C Division, and so is it fair to say that if your members were not at Roxham Road, that they would be investigating drug traffickers, gun smugglers, and other similar criminals?
They'd be assigned to other priorities under the federal policing mandate in the province, correct?
So given that, is it safe then to assume that that other criminals are not getting investigated to the extent they might be if officers weren't spending time at Roxham Road?
Well, like our mandate is fairly complex, and with the resources we have, we prioritize what needs to be done and assign the right resources to the priorities.
So if Roxham Road wasn't a priority, would that be better for the overall rate of crime in Quebec and in Canada?
You'd redistribute the resources within the other units that we have in the province: serious and organized crime, financial crime, national security.
Mr. Roach, you worked at Roxham Road, or you're very familiar with Roxham Road. I want to talk a little bit about smuggling. You'd mentioned smuggling in your statement. When you're interviewing people, did you uncover evidence of smuggling?
There'll be evidence of the coordination, definitely coordinated efforts for smuggling. Sometimes it's links to individuals that are already in Canada. Sometimes it's individuals in the States or across abroad internationally. So that all comes through the interviews, depending on the individuals that we're interacting with. We've had many cases of smuggling where we lay charges in Canada, either groups that were already established in Canada, but sometimes, they are in the States.
So on that, what percentage of, if you have 100 people come across, is there, 10%, 20%, and how many cases have you laid, charges have you laid for smuggling?
I don't have the exact number for of cases that we lay charges, but and in terms of percentage, it wouldn't be. It's not a vast majority, but there is presence of human smuggling.
If I may, Madam Chair, just to add, it's a challenge to get, once the people are across, it's a challenge to get them to talk because they've reached their goal. They're across. The idea is how do you intercept them beforehand so that you can get them to talk a little bit more. But it is a challenge once they're on Canadian soil to get them to talk about the process and the structure that's in place.
Thank you. How much time do I have, Madam Chair?
Your time is up.
Thank you.
Okay, time is up, and now we will proceed to Mr. Dhaliwal. Mr. Dhaliwal, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My first question will go to IRB. Thank you for the presentation to both all CBSA, IRB, and the RCMP. and the work that you fellows are doing in people's lives. And a question going to our IRB is this, that Mr. Wax mentioned that even though the wait time are the lowest since 2016-17, but we are still hearing that there is a long wait when it comes to processing the claims for the asylum seekers. Could Mr. Wax tell us what some of the things IRB can do to elevate the time taken to process these applications?
Well, thank you very much to the member through the chair. First of all, the wait times for new claims, as of let's say today, anybody making a new claim at the IRB will be processed within the next 16 months, based on current inventories and trends. Secondly, we have about 65,000 in our inventory right now. A third of those are not actionable because we're waiting for either documentation or security screening or this or that. So that leaves about 45,000 in our claims inventory right now that is actionable. They have been heard, they are on the schedule or will be placed on the schedule within the next 11 months. So from an IRB's perspective, with what is in our inventory and with what is actionable, they have been or will be scheduled within 11 months. In terms of things that can be done, the IRB over the past number of years has taken on a pretty ambitious transformation agenda that I alluded to in my opening remarks, and with a real focus on a culture of performance and results. We understand what the asylum seekers have been through. They have a very long journey. It's been a very challenging journey to them. They faced many challenges on their way to the IRB, including long processing times throughout the process. We've taken that on board. It's been a tough problem, and we've looked at everything from intake to recourse to try and expedite our processing times. One initiative in particular that I'll speak to, although there are many, is with respect to the Task Force on Less Complex Claims. This is an initiative that tries to best allocate our resources based on the complexity of the claims in question. This is a group of individuals, members of the Refugee Protection Division that Rula heads up. There's 10% of the complement are currently dedicated to this group, and over the past 4 years or so since this group was established, they finalized about 20% of the hearings. What this does is increase access to justice more quickly for those individuals in our inventory and better utilizes our resources. That is one example of many where we've tried to instill and initiate new ideas and new approaches to expedite processing times with good effect.
Thank you. And now my question, Madam Chair, will go to all three organizations. But I'm hearing from many people are there. They're asking us to declare entire Canada-US border to be an official point of entry. And also mentioning there are almost 2.5 million people that have illegally came through Mexico-US border into US. And if we do not have this safe, third safe country agreement in place, what would be the consequences moving forward? Start with the RCMP, then CBSA, RCMP, and then IRB.
I don't have any consequences that come to mind other than we in my introduction remarks I did say the reasons why we do the background checks. We want to know who those people are. For the most part, there's not much on the criminal side of things, but obviously if it starts pouring in, like south of the border when you see the Americans in Mexico, there is a concern with who's coming in, and that's why at Roxham Road and other places across the country, we try and put as much rigor as we can doing the checks of the people that are coming in on the various data banks, and as well as with our international partners when we can.
CBSA?
If I understand the question correctly, I guess from my point of view, the biggest concern that I have is the safety of the individuals coming into Canada. And the safest way to come into Canada is at an official point of entry. So if you're crossing between points of entry, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the conditions, you're taking on personal risk, additional risk that may not be warranted. So I think regardless of whether the SDCA is in place or not, we encourage people to come across at points of entry, primarily, first and foremost, for their own personal safety.
IRB?
Thank you. I understand the question being if Safe Third is not enforced, what would the major implications be?
Yes.
I mean, look, there's a couple of implications I'll speak to quickly. First and foremost, obviously, the incentive to proceed irregularly would be no longer there, and so that will encourage the flow to have people cross at the border, which would disperse the impact in any one area, I guess, at Roxham Road. I think people are very familiar with that. But in terms of operation, and there are other aspects to it, obviously, the Safe Third was created for certain purposes in terms of, promoting safety, promoting international responsibility sharing, and so on and so forth. So those things would no longer be there, but necessarily. But from an operational perspective, obviously the concern is that it's going to result in pressure on the asylum system, additional pressure. That's from an operational perspective. That's different than from a humanitarian perspective. There's basically three buckets. There's irregular border crossers.
Sorry for interrupting, Mr. Wex. Time is up for Mr. Dhaliwal. We will have to proceed to the next member. Mr. Brunel Duceppe, you are up next. You will have 6 minutes for your round of questioning.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to all of the witnesses who are here with us today. You do a superhuman job, I think, and you try to do it as well as you can. And I really have heard nothing but good about the RCMP officers who welcome immigrants. You have a very good reputation. I can tell you that when people come in through Roxham Road. Mr. Wex, did you say that if we were to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, it would increase the number of asylum seekers along the border?
Sorry, if we were to suspend it, I'm just trying to get this straight. If we were to suspend it and it's no longer in force, then obviously the purposes of the Safe Third Country Agreement would no longer be there. And so, yes, there is a concern by some that in suspending the agreement, there's going to be a pull factor. Nobody knows what that. I shouldn't say nobody knows. There are projections, but there is some conjecture associated with the degree and extent to which that pull factor will materialize. Nonetheless, we understand that projections are that there will be a material impact at the border. When you look back 20 years ago, prior to the Safe Third Country Agreement, one of the reasons why the Safe Third Country Agreement was put in place, there was a security perimeter negotiations that were taking place between Canada and the United States, which took on more force after 9/11. One of the files that was discussed at that time was Safe Third, because at that time, about a third of Canada's...
Excusez-moi, monsieur.
I'm so sorry. I'm just going to interrupt you because I don't actually have a lot of time. But there is no document or study that shows that there would be an increase of asylum seekers if we were to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. So you're saying that that's what you feel, but there's no study to that effect.
I'm not aware of the exact impact that suspending Safe Third would have on port of entry, on various ports of entry. I know.
No, je vais vous arrêter là. Parfait. Merci. Excusez-moi.
Yes, sorry. Great. Perfect. I'm sorry. I'm very short of time. So. And now for the RCMP. On September 28th, the Minister of Public Safety answered a question in the House of Commons and told us when it comes to the smugglers, the government recognized that it was a challenge at Roxham Road, and that is why the government had invested over $40 million in a strategy to try to solve the problem of human trafficking, and wanted to increase the resources at the border to help with the system and to try to stop abuses of the system. That's what we heard in the House of Commons, but I don't know whether any criminal that was working at Roxham Road has actually been brought to justice. Is that right? That's right. So you are aware then that there are networks of human smugglers, and the government knows it too. And we are being told that there are talks with the Americans and that there are people who will be brought to justice. But are there any investigations underway in the RCMP with regard to smuggling, to human smuggling? Answer, yes. There are a number of investigators who are investigating this because we look into we have Valleyfield and we have Champlain in Quebec. Those are the detachments that cover Roxham Road. We have some in the Estrie region and the Beauce region as well. So we cover all of that part of the border, and we work with our counterparts in the United States. We have arrested people and we have charged them with human smuggling. So yes, there have been, but not at Roxham. Not at Roxham Road as such, no. I don't think we've had any specific situations, but throughout Quebec, yes. But there are crimes that have been, or criminals that have been apprehended there with regard to child pornography, links to organized crime, for example, people who have committed crimes in the United States and arrive at Roxham Road, for example. Question. I'm not sure whether you saw the Radio-Canada show about human traffickers and who commit a crime in the United States, and that it's also a crime in Canada, but the crime itself is committed in the United States. And the journalist was able to follow the person all the way through to Florida. So I imagine that you talk to your American counterparts when you have a situation like this. So, there are a number of white vans that have to set out on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. We heard that too. So I'm wondering why it is that smugglers continue to operate. I'm asking that question, in fact. Answer. So yes, the information you've mentioned is public, but of course it's easier for journalists to get certain types of information to begin a journalistic investigation than the police. And so when people have arrived in the country where they wanted to get to, it can be difficult to get them to help us with our investigations. So I understand, and so that's what should happen on the other side of the border. They should be stopped before they cross the border, no? Answer. Well, there is a joint effort, not just nationally with the RCMP, but internationally as well. I also have a question for the CBSA. Could you tell the committee how things happened before the Safe Third Country Agreement when somebody came from the United States and made an asylum request?
Thank you for the question. Through the chair, thank you for the question. Our processes are in place are the same regardless of whether or not the Safe Third Country Agreement is in place. It's a question of how and when they arrive in the country. So I'm not familiar with the processes that were pre-SDCA in 2014.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up for Mr. Brunel Duceppe. We will now proceed to Ms. Kwan. Ms. Kwan, you will have 6 minutes. You can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I also want to say thank you to all the departments for the work that you're doing for our country. With respect to the Safe Third Country Agreement, I guess one of the issues, of course, is that the numbers will ebb and flow with the arrivals for people wanting to cross into Canada irregularly. I wonder if the IRB could provide the committee after this meeting the data on the actual numbers over the years. Maybe if we can get the numbers perhaps prior to the Safe Third Country Agreement and then since that time to current, so that we can see the fluctuation that's occurred within the borders. Is that possible? And maybe if prior to the Safe Third Country Agreement, could we get it for the last 10 years prior?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, the board will undertake to do what it can for the member's request. I just want to make sure I understand the question. Is it with respect to numbers that are currently identified as ineligible, or is it So I'm just trying to make sure I understand the question.
Sorry, just numbers of the people who's arrived at the border crossing irregularly.
Irregularly, I can certainly.
Irregularly.
Yes, irregularly. We have that number. I can provide that numbers to you now. We can provide that number to you another time. Yes,
if you can provide the numbers to us after the committee meeting.
Absolutely. Since 2017, we can provide the numbers to you. Not so much in terms of crossing the border, in terms of numbers that have come to the IRB, referred to the IRB that are irregular. We can provide that number to you. Since 2017, it's 72,500.
Thank you. I like to have the breakdown year by year And then if you can also provide the information on if you have that information, the demographics of the people coming across the border. My next question is actually, thank you. My next question is actually to the CBSA. And with respect to processing, one of the issues that's been brought to our attention from a witness is for the asylum seeker to get their documentation, what they call as the brown paper document. Because of the influx in the numbers, I understand there's pressure on the CBSA in terms of staffing. And now there's a practice of providing an entry for further examination document. Can you advise the committee how long is it taking for people to get the to be able to get the brown paper documents so that they can move on to the next phase of their asylum claim?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And maybe I'll just take this opportunity to reiterate our processes are in place regardless of whether the SDCA is there or not. At Roxham Road, is in an effort to deal with volumes initially, we were processing in two parts. We did an initial assessment upon arrival, and then we adjourned the claim for a later date to be finalized, an eligibility interview at the Urban Processing Center. As a result of that, what we've seen with the volumes we have, and we're doing that because it takes about 4 to 6 hours to do a claim in person. We've seen that eligibility backlog increase due to this two-step process where it's now taking up to 18 months for somebody to get that eligibility interview and to get their documentation. To address that, we've done a couple of things. One is we've introduced, as I alluded to, what we call our one-step process, where low risk and people with full documentation are fully assessed upon arrival. They're allowed to leave. They're given the documentation they require, so they have rights to employment and they have rights to social and medical care, and they have to complete their paperwork on our online portal within 45 days. So that is the effect of that is to reduce the growth of the eligibility backlog. The other innovation that we put in place is the use of this digital portal. So I've said it takes 18 months, up to 18 months. That's the worst case scenario. If individuals apply their, if individuals apply their, provide their information via our online portal, which is more user-friendly, more reliable, more accurate, they can get an interview within 90 days. And that would then close their eligibility claim and then move forward in the system.
I asked this question because currently right now we had a witness actually just this week advising us, who works with the refugee center, that people are waiting in a prolonged period. They are not actually getting their brown paper document. So in this expedited process that you now mentioned, since when has it been in place?
We launched on November 1st, and we're already seeing immediate benefits from that. The portal has been in place for, I'd say, a couple of months, Carl? Couple of months, and again, we're seeing immediate benefits there. So the portal is available to anybody in that 18-month, up to 18-month waiting list. And the benefit from our point of view of the portal is it's more user-friendly, it's plain language, it's more accurate.
Sorry, I'm limited on time. I'm limited on time. And so maybe you can provide the committee with this data as well. How many people, asylum seekers, that are in what stages of the wait period? If you can provide that information to us for Roxham Road, that would be appreciated. With respect to your comment, which I appreciate as well, to say if in fact people went through the official ports of entry, it would reduce, I think, the dangers to which people encounter on the road, on the journey to try to get to Canada, to seek asylum and to seek safety. And so that is an important point to note. And from that perspective, would it also create better organization in terms of the management of the situation currently right now for CBSA and for the RCMP for that matter? So my question is to the RCMP and for CBSA.
Go ahead.
I think, arriving through the point of
entry. Sorry for interrupting, Ms. Kwan. Time is up. We will now proceed to our second round, and based on the time, we will have 2.5 minutes for Mr. Maguire and then Ms. Lalonde, and then 1.5 minutes each for Mr. Brunel-Duceppe and Ms. Kwan, and then we will end this panel. So we will go to Mr. Maguire. Mr. Maguire, you will have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses, but I just had my time cut in half, so we're going to run here. I need some yes or no's. Mr. Wex, thank you for all of your testimonies. But according to the latest statistics published in the IRCC's website, the number of people who have irregularly crossed over the border to claim asylum are now higher than ever. I think it's 31,003 is the number I have here today, have been intercepted by the RCMP in 2022. There are reports that up to 50,000 people might walk across the border this year. So has the IRC or any other department provided the IRB any estimates of the number of people they expect to walk across the border for the remainder of this year or any future year? Yes or no?
The testimony that was given by the Deputy Minister, I think it was last week of IRCC, is consistent with the numbers that we've seen as well. We have a good line of sight. They share with us the number of irregular border crossers that they have in their inventory.
Can you just in light of time here, can you table that in relevant documents with the committee?
It's not our documents, it's IRCC's documents. Just be 5 seconds. They receive the referrals first, and then it comes to IRB, and sometimes that could take 6 to 12 months. And so there's a lag.
Has IRCC provided any of those documents to IRB?
Which documents would those be?
On the numbers of people that are going to be crossing the border?
Well, we're already at the 10th month of 12. I think they've identified in previous testimony that up to 45 or 50,000 irregular border crossers could cross between January and December of this year.
All I'm looking at is the number of estimates of those people coming across. I'm sure there's a document.
I haven't seen a document necessarily, but I have been briefed to that.
Thank you. I'll move on. The most recent department performance report, the IRB's target to process cases within the legislated timelines was only 50%. That's a tremendously low target to meet legislative timelines. And the worst of the part is that the actual results were only 17%. So after the last influx of irregular border crossers, the Auditor General tabled a troubling report that found many deficiencies in the IRB. As you were the chair at that time and are now, I'd like to get some clarity on the IRB's implementation of the Auditor General's recommendations that the IRB accepted. And the first one would be, as requested, did the IRB update its performance targets used to report on intake capacity and productivity? I believe you said yes in your testimony, so thank you. And so can you please table that process of how the IRB implemented that recommendation?
Yes, I can. Very quickly,
can you just table that with us for our information?
I'm happy to table our operational plans for the year with performance targets, yes.
Thank you. The Auditor General discovered...
Thank you. Time is up, Mr. Maguire. Time is up. We will now proceed to Ms. Lalonde. Ms. Lalonde, you will have 2.5 minutes. You can please proceed.
Yes, I'd like to begin by thanking you all for being here, and I'd like to come back to something so that I can get clarification. Mr. Wex, I think you were talking about 50,000 people. Who are they? Who are these people? Is that only Roxham Road, or is that all asylum seekers throughout Canada, according to your figures?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I really don't want to speak for IRCC's intake and CBSA's intake. I can really only speak to IRB's intake. Again, they're further upstream in the system, and we're downstream, and there's a 6 to 12-month lag. I can report and share with this committee that from January to November of this year, we have received a total of 47,600 asylum seekers during this year, and we have a pending inventory of about 66,000, a third of which are non-actionable, as I testified earlier.
So just for clarification for myself, so Mr. Wex, these numbers are for all asylum seekers within Canada?
The numbers that I'm referring to are the numbers, yes, for both regular border crossers and irregular border crossers. We have received 47,000 at the IRB this year. IRCC would have received something else. Just to be very clear, the board does not make any distinction in the adjudication of claims between regular claimants and irregular border crossers. It's of no consequence from an adjudicative perspective. It has other consequences across the system that we're discussing, but I want to be clear on that point.
I appreciate this actually because that's very relevant for what we were talking about. And maybe just to continue, you are responsible for granting status for refugee claimants who arrive in Canada and certainly make an asylum claim. As such, can you provide the committee how the IRB has modernized and innovated their responsibility to refugee claimants who cross Roxham Road since the pandemic, please? And did you encounter any setback during this time?
In terms of the various measures that are in place to deal with the influx at Roxham Road, we've introduced a number of measures over the past number of years. We're very much alive to the journeys that they have undertaken over the past number of years, at Roxham Road. I would point out just two. With respect to our basis of claim form, which is our main form, we've extended the timelines for filing and also abridged what is required to be filled out, recognizing that there is so much pressure at Roxham Road, it is difficult for many of these claimants to have access to counsel.
Sorry for interrupting.
In as timely a manner as they used to. That is but one of many measures taken. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We will now proceed to Mr. Brunel Desep for 90 seconds. Mr. Brunel Desep, you can please begin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes or no answer, please, if possible. Is it a crime to ask people for money to have them cross the border? I'm talking to the RCMP now. You're talking about people in the United States who ask for in the United States? Well, in the United States, the law enforcement is different. They don't have the same powers. But here in Canada, if somebody commits a crime in the United States or wants to commit a crime in the United States, we can charge them here. But in the United States, they can't do that. That's the nuance. So I'm not actually sure what the United States would do. But is it a crime to ask for money to help cross a border according to Canadian law? Yes? Yes, that is. So have there been any requests by the RCMP to the U.S. authorities to stop people who commit those kinds of crimes? Yeah, but as I was saying, they don't have the same laws as we do. We are in constant communication, but they don't have the same legislative framework. So you haven't really been able to manage to do that. But don't you worry when you see the white vans come up along Roxham Road? Well, there are many, but the dynamic has changed over the years. There are a number of charitable organizations that are involved as well. So it is very difficult to be able to make distinctions. Mr. Wex, I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of time. I don't want to be rude. But could you tell us what the process is to make seek asylum from the United States before the Safe Third Country Agreement came into force? What was the process before? Thank you.
In the United States?
For an asylum seeker coming to Canada from the United States, seeking asylum in Canada, what was the process before the Safe Third Country Agreement?
And it could be, I stand to be corrected, was that the process would be the same. There wouldn't be an agreement that would necessarily require that the individual be returned to the United States for processing.
Sorry for interrupting. Time is up for Mr. Brunel Desep. We will now proceed to Ms. Kwan. Ms. Kwan, you will have 90 seconds, and then we will end this panel.
Thank you. Just to build on that, prior to the Safe Third Country Agreement, people cross over at the regular border crossings, right? To Mr. Rex.
Yes, that's definitely my understanding in the vast majority of cases.
Thank you. Now, with respect to the IRB's projections, the numbers to which you anticipate that are coming in to process the IRB asylum applications, what sort of funding do you project that you would require in order to process this in a way that does not create the extended delays and backlog that we previously had?
Well, right now, as you're aware, we're funded just most recently to 50,000 claims per year. We're expecting about 75,000 claims to come in this year. That's an additional 25,000, which will add 6 months to our processing times. For every 10,000 that there's a difference between our intake and our processing capacity, that will cost the IRB about $45 or $50 million per year. That's basically our funding formula. And so the math can be done. But right now there is a delta of more than 10,000.
Thank you very much. Now, when I was first elected back in 2015, there was a huge backlog with respect to the IRB. There were a whole bunch of problems, including the lack of resources in financial sense, but as well as the staffing levels at the IRB. The IRB went through years of only hiring people part-time. Has that now ended? Has the IRB hired people on a full-time basis and on a permanent basis to address and processing of applicants?
Thank you very much for the question. With the monies received in Budget 2022, we will be able to make permanent about 1,000 FTEs at the IRB that were previously funded by temporary funds through budgets 2018 to 2020. We are going through the stabilization exercise now. Over 50% of our organization for the past few years has been temporary, and the government investments now will allow us to stabilize the organizations, which is very, very important for recruitment, retention, morale, and productivity.
Thank you. With that, this panel comes to an end, and on behalf of all the
Madam Chair?
This committee, yes, Mr. McGuire.
Yes, this is extremely interesting testimony, and I know there's a number of questions that my colleague and I still have. I'm just going to table these with the clerk and ask that they provide us with answers to those. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses for appearing before the committee, and whatever information the committee would request, if it would be great if you can submit that, and if there is anything which you were not able to discuss because of the time limit, you can always send us the written submissions. So Mr. McGuire, the clerk will send that information to them. Thank you. And with that, this panel comes to an end, and the meeting is suspended so that the clerk can do the sound checks for the other witnesses, because 2 witnesses will be appearing virtually. Thank you. all the witnesses for appearing before the committee. Today, we are joined by Mr. Stefan Hanfield as an individual, a lawyer from Hanfield L. Associate Advocate. We are also joined by Mr. Yannick Boucher, the Director, Strategic Development and Research, representing the organization École Liaison pour Arrivants. And our third witness for today is Madame Marzia Nazakat, Manager, Refugee Settlement and Integration Program from Multilingual Orientation Service Association for Immigrant Communities. We will begin with Mr. Hanfield. Mr. Hanfield, you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. You can please begin, and once we have remarks from all the three witnesses, we will go to our round of questioning. So, Mr. Hanfield, you can please begin.
Bonjour, merci.
Hello, thank you for inviting me to be here. I have been a member of the Quebec Bar since 1992. I was a member of the Immigration and Refugee Board for 11 years, and from 2012 to 2015, I was a lecturer at the Cégep Saint-Laurent in the Administrative Technology Immigration Consulting Services program. I'm a member of the Quebec Immigration Lawyers Association and the Montreal Defense Lawyers Association, and I practice immigration law exclusively at Hanfield and Associates, lawyers at law, and I also serve as an inspector in the Professional Inspection Service of the Quebec Bar. I worked on the book Quiet Dismantling, published by Éditions Québec Amérique in 2018. I published Immigration and Crime in Canada, When Deportation Becomes Inevitable, published by Wilson and Lafleur in 2020, and Fatima, The Journey of a Refugee, which was also published by Wilson and Lafleur in 2020. When it comes to welcoming refugees, of course, the Safe Third Country Agreement cannot be ignored. Under this agreement, a person who presents him or herself to the Canadian-U.S. border crossing will have his or her refugee claim deemed inadmissible and will be returned to the United States unless they fall within an exception under the agreement, for example, an unaccompanied minor or the presence of a family member in Canada. However, if that same person crosses the border irregularly, he or she will not fall under the Safe Third Country Agreement, and their refugee claim will be deemed admissible. That is why thousands of people have crossed the border irregularly in recent years to seek Canada's protection. In fact, since January 2022, 99.3% of entries are in Quebec. Those entries are in Quebec. Under the Safe Third Country Agreement, a person will not have a right of appeal to the Refugee Appeal Division if their refugee claim is rejected if the claim is made at a land border crossing during a regular crossing. However, if that same person crosses the border at Roxham Road, they will have a right of appeal if their refugee claim is decided negatively or turned down by the IRB. In short, all of this means that asylum seekers are encouraged to cross the border irregularly, because if they do, their claim will be deemed admissible. There will be no return to the United States, and they will retain a right of appeal. The government is aware of this situation. From January to October 2022, more than 30,000 people crossed the border at Roxham Road, and if the trend continues, there will be close to 50,000 by the end of the year. The record was set in 2017. At the time, it was 18,836 asylum seekers who had crossed the border in this way, regularly. In early October 2022, New York City Mayor Eric Adams said that he expected to receive nearly 100,000 migrants deported or who had been sent out of the state of Texas in his city and who would want to go to other destinations. We can therefore rightly think that one of the destinations will be Roxham Road. In Portland, Maine, hundreds of migrants dream of Roxham Road. The system is broken, not people who must be denounced. People who in many cases are exploited by unscrupulous smugglers. We must know how to welcome people, but also how to integrate them properly according to our capacity. If there's a housing crisis, there's a lack of early childhood education places, there's a shortage of family doctors and teachers, and the challenges of francization all mean that there's a possible humanitarian crisis on the horizon. Also, many asylum seekers are unwittingly become homeless. The number of refugee claimants crossing the border at Roxham Road has an impact on processing times, but also on the work of Refugee Protection Division members. There's a problem with interference and the deteriorating working conditions of the commissioners. Now is the time to permanently close this irregular, unofficial access to the infamous Roxham Road. It is important to note that the Government of Canada has the authority to unilaterally suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement under Article 10 of that agreement. Either party may, by written notice to the other, suspend the operation of the Safe Third Country Agreement for not more than 3 months, and such a suspension can be renewed for an additional period of not more than 3 months. The status quo is no longer the solution. A minimum of political will is required. It is high time. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will proceed to Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, you will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks. You can please begin.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Hello, we welcome today's initiative that makes it possible to speak to Parliament about the situation of people who have chosen Canada as a safe place, as was just mentioned. The issues and challenges that were described just before me and that affect asylum seekers throughout their journey have a number of human, economic, and structural impacts. It has to do with having access to a job, to health, legal services, childcare services, etc. As a frontline organization when it comes to immigration and integration, and for 38 years now, we will provide a summary of our observations on the ground when it comes to the situation in Quebec for asylum seekers, and we'll call them ASs, if you will. So there are a number of things that would facilitate their integration, and then that is what we will outline, or I will outline. So first, to improve access to quality jobs through a work permit that is given to them as soon as they arrive. Second, access to psychosocial services for asylum seekers who are in federal hotels in Quebec. And also to have an awareness-raising campaign for the interim federal health program and to develop models for transitional housing. We are convinced that it is essential to support initiatives that value the experience of asylum seekers, because we don't know what their work history is. Because we also have an unprecedented shortage of workers in Quebec. Therefore, our organization, with the support of Service Québec, will have a job fair for asylum seekers. It is a wonderful opportunity for asylum seekers to get out of the informal jobs that keep them vulnerable in many cases. So we welcome the number of initiatives by the IRCC to increase the number of work permits issued and the speed at which they are issued. But we know that in order to access those services, people have to have their asylum seeker documents to get a social insurance number, for example. And this can take a very long time. They need an interview as well, and before it would happen when they arrived or within 24 hours. And now we have a delay in a situation where there is such a shortage of workers. We can see that this is causing distress in asylum seekers because they have administrative things to do and they're worried about the legal repercussions of it, and it adds on to the trauma that these people have experienced in their home countries and along their journey to come to Canada. It is important for the asylum seekers in Quebec to receive services from the federal government as well, and to have access to housing as well as those who go through the regional program for welcoming and integrating asylum seekers in Quebec. We also want the federal interim health program to be better known in Quebec, and therefore we need to increase its profile because there's a gap when it comes to health services, and it's important to be able to understand the processes to access the federal program. It would also be good to ensure that there is a link between the federal program and the Quebec health insurance program so that there can be a better health attention provided to asylum seekers. We also need transitional housing programs so that we can support asylum seekers when they seek their own housing. Quebec is the only province that provides temporary housing when people arrive, because it is virtually impossible for people to find housing without a prior rental history and a reference from a prior landlord. We need to ensure that there is a transitional housing program so that people who go to the temporary shelter, that go from the temporary shelters to actual housing, have somewhere to go and can build their housing records, if you will. I'll be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will now proceed to our third witness, Madame Nezaket. Madame Nezaket, you can please begin. You will have 5 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear on this very important subject. My name is Marzia Nezaket, and I'm the manager of Refugee Settlement and Integration at Mosaic. Mosaic is one of the largest nonprofit organizations in Canada serving immigrant, refugee, and mainstream communities throughout the province of BC and overseas via online programs. Mosaic is also one of the largest organizations funded by the province to serve refugee claimants in partnership with other agencies across BC. At Mosaic, I oversee programs that serve approximately 2,000 refugee claimants each year. I also oversee the BC Refugee Claimant Housing Referral and Data Management System, the BC CHARMS. The first of its kind in Western Canada, this province-wide centralized housing referral system aims at connecting refugee claimants with safe and affordable housing across the province of BC. Today, I would like to take time to highlight some of the experiences of refugee claimants served by Mosaic relating to their safety, security, and health. Christmas time 2021, I received a call from the Red Cross about a family of 11 who had irregularly crossed the border and intercepted by the RCMP, covered in mud, hungry and robbed, looking for shelter and food. A young woman in her 20s crossing the border irregularly and not intercepted had somehow found her way to Mosaic's office in the late afternoon. She was soaking wet and shaken, repeatedly asking in her native language if we were going to send her back to the border or if she was going to be deported. After irregularly crossing the border and intercepted by the RCMP, a 7-month pregnant woman whose husband was deported at the U.S. border was sent to Mosaic to receive support for food and shelter. She was then called to the CBSA office, detained for the night, and sent back to the U.S. Her cousin told us later about her difficult situation at the Immigration Holding Center the night before she was sent back. A single mom with 3 young children were found by the VPD on the streets of Vancouver around midnight. A VPD officer had a connection with a church who took care of them for the night before sending them to Mosaic. Over the past 2 months, Mosaic has received 2 families who, as indicated by the STCA, were found ineligible to make a claim in Canada. With an exclusion order banning them to re-enter Canada for a year, they crossed the border irregularly and found their way to Mosaic for help. The amount of trauma these families with their young kids have gone through is beyond expression, considering the fact that many of these individuals might have been subject to human trafficking to make their way to Canada. Not having a status, the guilt and shame of having crossed the border irregularly and been denied for a refugee claim has a toll on these refugee claimants. According to IRCC statistics from the January to October this year, the number of refugee claimants intercepted by RCMP in BC has increased by 233% compared to the same time last year and 130% to the pre-pandemic time in 2019. The refugee claimants who cross the border without being intercepted or to make a claim inland. When claiming at official ports of entry, claimants can immediately apply for income assistance, which is received in less than 3 weeks, and receive a deadline for less than 2 months for their eligibility interview. If found eligible, they can anticipate receiving a work permit in 3 to 4 months. However, when making a claim inland, the claim process takes months longer, and claimants are left with no income assistance and delayed work permits to up to 18 months, which makes earning a living nearly impossible. Knowing these drawbacks to making a claim inland, why would refugee claimants take the risk of irregularly crossing the border? The answer is the risk of being deported or returned to the U.S. The majority of individuals who cross the border have exhausted their financial resources making their way from their countries of origin to common transitory countries in South America, continuing through the U.S. and eventually reaching Canada. By not being able to obtain a work permit in a timely manner, they're left with seeking aid by the community or settlement agencies or working illegally as their last resort, which by itself is a whole different story of getting exposed to discrimination, stigmatization, and all sorts of potential abuse by employers. In closing, I want to remind the respected committee that regardless of all the challenges refugee claimants face, they have and continue to contribute immensely to Canada's social fabric. And at Mosaic, we recognize seeking asylum as a human right and adhere to the core humanitarian principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality in our daily practices. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Madame Nezaket, for your opening remarks. We will now go to our round of questioning. We will have one round of questioning of 5 minutes each, and then we will go in camera for the committee business for last 10 minutes. We will start our round of questioning with Mr. Berthold. Mr. Berthold, you will have 5 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to thank our witnesses, and I would like to start by saying that I thank the members for giving me the opportunity to speak today and ask questions. As you know, irregular immigration, people who cross the border irregularly, either at Roxham Road or anywhere else in the country, as Ms. Nezakat just mentioned, is a major concern. And I think that what we forget is that we are talking about human beings, about families who have undergone difficult situations and have made a difficult choice to come and settle in Canada. It's important to recognize that we are talking about human stories above all. And I think that we may forget that a little too often in this process. In our riding offices, I can confirm to the witnesses that we see situations on a daily basis that are, frankly, sad because there are people who have come into Canada using the Roxham Road, and they've come with their family, they've integrated into the community, and then they're getting sent back to the United States. So I think that we don't welcome people properly. But my first question is for Mr. Hanfield. Mr. Hanfield, Roxham Road is a solution. Well, you seem to be asking that the Safe Third Country Agreement be suspended. But what will that change in the daily lives of the people who cross the border there? Answer. Well, people will go to an official point of entry, not only in Quebec, but throughout Canada. So the flow of asylum seekers who have no other resort but to go through Roxham Road because of the Safe Third Country Agreement, well, then if that agreement doesn't grow, well, they'll go to an official entry point, and there they will receive adequate processing there, not just in Quebec, but throughout Canada. And that's what happened before the agreement went into effect. Question, but what concerns me is that our capacity to welcome people, and we've heard it in the testimony, we don't have the capacity to welcome any more people. And I'm concerned, and please stop me if I'm wrong, but I'm concerned that if we do suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement, we are sending a message to everyone, and that'll be used by the human traffickers and to ill-intentioned people throughout the Americas. They'll say, listen, the Canadian border is open. You can go in anywhere you want. And I don't think that in a short turnaround, we will be able to welcome that many people. So perhaps all of the witnesses can answer that question. So yes, so the message now that is being sent is that you can get into Canada if you take Roxham Road. So nothing has prevented thousands of migrants, regardless of where they are in the world, to get into Canada through that Roxham Road entry. So what we're saying is, yes, come to Canada, do it officially, and you'll have more rights and a right of appeal, for example. So what you're saying is it will open more doors? Answer, no, we will distribute the asylum seekers across the Canadian border as it existed before. And as you know, Section 10 of the agreement makes it possible for the Canadian government to unilaterally suspend the agreement for 3 months and to renew that suspension, if you will, every 3 months. So you can suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement and then see what happens and then see what to do. Yes, I understand. I understand. We don't have a lot of time. So I just wanted to make sure that we understand what you're saying, because what scares me is sending a message if we don't actually explain the process for being welcomed into Canada. Because what I was saying earlier is that it takes so long for the answer to be given to asylum seekers. It can take 2-3 years, you know it as a lawyer. And then if you're told after 2 or 3 years that you as an asylum seeker have to go back into your country, well, then we have to remember that we're dealing with human beings, and it's a terrible situation to be in. Monsieur Boucher, perhaps you could answer, because we don't have a lot of time left, or I don't have a lot of time left. I actually agree with my fellow witness. I'm not sure that we do have the capacity to have to welcome refugees, because if you look at Canada, and we don't welcome even 5% of humanitarian refugees from around the world. So I think this burden has to be shared by the provinces in Canada. It can't be focused on Quebec, because Quebec has no resources. Everybody is getting worn out.
And now we will proceed to Mr. Al-Khouri. Mr. Al-Khouri, you will have 5 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to welcome our witnesses. My first question is for Ms. Nezakat. Thank you very much for your testimony, and the examples that you gave are heartbreaking. I would like to ask you why you think there was such an increase in the number of people using Mosaic's services.
Thank you so much for the question. So Mosaic has always received many refugee claimants. As I mentioned, we are one of the major organizations in BC working with refugee claimants. We have a specific stream of services for refugee claimants. So like any other organization, we had a decrease in numbers during COVID time. But then as the borders opened in November 2021, we started receiving many more refugee claimants. As I mentioned, and I shared the statistics in BC, the number of people who are now intercepted by RCMP trying to cross irregularly has increased. I believe one reason is compared to the past 2 years, it's because of after the COVID time and the borders are open now. But when you compare them to the pre-pandemic, I would say the numbers have increased, but not to a degree that you would say like it is unprecedented. I would say one of the major reasons of this increase would be the refugee crisis all around the world. So when you compare the situation of the world today with like 3 years ago, you can see that many different crises are happening around the world. So more and more people would want to seek protection in Canada. So I would see that as one of the major reasons to the increase.
Madame, d'après vous,
Yes. So what do you think could really be done to reduce the incentive to use irregular ways of crossing the border?
Thank you for the question. So as a settlement agency who provides services, we would really support dignified claim processes for refugee claimants. And we all know that when they try to cross irregularly, it is contrary to being dignified or have dignity. So I would say if there is encouragement or there is this certainty that can be given to asylum seekers that if you cross regularly through the official ports of entry, you are going to be processed in a dignified manner, a faster process, and you get to stay in Canada if you are found eligible, they would not really risk their lives going through the forests and putting themselves and their families in danger as we see today. So there has to be this certainty or assurance or reassurance to these people that if you cross regularly through the official ports of entry, you are not going to be returned, you're not going to be deported. So do what it is safer for you and your families, and with more dignity, of course.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher, you said that there is a health program that is not well known in Quebec. Could you give us more details about what our government can do to maximize the benefits that it provides in your province? Thank you for your question. So yes, the federal program, which is a bit like the Quebec Health Insurance Program that covers health care, is the interim federal health program. So within the healthcare system in Quebec, there's very little known about the IHFP. So when emergency health services are needed, for example, the healthcare workers in Quebec don't know what to do with asylum seekers. Asylum seekers don't know either. They're eligible for health insurance in Quebec, but they haven't applied for it, perhaps. So it is very confusing, and we need tools so that asylum seekers can figure out what to do and how to register and get onto the federal program list first, and then make it possible for them to get access to health services in Quebec hospitals rather than falling through the cracks. And so that we can really give them the feeling that their health is important.
Proceed to Mr. Brunel Duceppe for 5 minutes. Mr. Brunel Duceppe, you can please begin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses as well on this second panel today. Mr. Handfield, last week I asked the Deputy Minister of the IRCC to tell me how the asylum-seeking process happens from the United States to Canada before the Safe Third Country Agreement. She was able to describe the process. Today, the CBSA representatives weren't able to answer that, and the IRB either. So I'm wondering why we can't get an answer from those officials, and what was the situation back in 2004? Answer. Well, I can't tell you what officials know or don't know, but I can tell you what I can tell you. So before the Safe Third Country Agreement, people who wanted to seek asylum and were coming to Canada through the United States would come to an official point of entry to customs somewhere in Canada, in British Columbia, Ontario, Manitoba, Quebec. So they would come in with dignity right through the front door rather than through the window, which is Roxham Road. Yes, so people were welcomed by CBSA, by the Canadian government. They didn't have to sleep in trailers on the side of the highway. Exactly. So some people think that there would be a huge increase in asylum seekers if the Safe Third Country Agreement were suspended, and we heard the Conservatives are worried about that. But are there any studies that prove that? And then second, I would like to hear your opinion on that and to hear a clear explanation of what would happen if the Safe Third Country Agreement were suspended. Answer. I do not know of any studies that show that if the agreement were suspended, we'd have 100,000, 200,000 more asylum seekers per year. So we have to look at what happened before the entry into effect of the Safe Third Country Agreement. Before that, we weren't getting a disproportionate flows of asylum seekers from year to year. It was fairly stable. So I don't see how suspending the agreement now would change that situation. Quite the contrary. I think that rather than funneling asylum seekers to Roxham Road, because we understand that it's 99.3% of asylum seekers who enter the country irregularly who are at Roxham Road. So if you, it's really just there that we see it in Canada. So if the agreement were suspended, then people wouldn't have to use smugglers to get through at Roxham Road, and we forget that because they have to deal with the smugglers. So other than that, if the agreement were suspended, then asylum seekers would have to present themselves or to go to an official point of entry and be treated with dignity. Question. So you are an immigration lawyer, and I mean, there are experts like you, community organizations as well. Most of the stakeholders here say that the agreement should be suspended, but the government refuses to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement. The government says that it wants to modernize that agreement, and it's been 4 years and nothing has happened. So why do you think the government isn't acting? Is it because they don't want to hurt the Americans' feelings? Answer. Well, I've been working on the Roxham Road file since 2017, and it's important to remember the government's position. In the summer of 2020, the federal court invalidated the Safe Third Country Agreement. It was challenged, and the first instance court invalidated it, and the government did not act in consequence. It appealed that decision, and of course, it went to the Supreme Court, and we are awaiting the decision in the coming weeks. So why is the government not budging on this question when all stakeholders are pushing it to suspend the Safe Third Country Agreement? Well, I said it earlier. Section 3 of the Safe Third Country Agreement makes it possible to suspend the agreement unilaterally for 3 months. We don't even need the agreement of the Americans. We could do that, suspend the agreement, see what happens in reality. And then if it doesn't work, well, then we come back to the agreement because what happened was true. The fears became a reality, and there were hundreds of thousands of more asylum seekers. So why isn't it happening? We have to ask the minister that. Question, yes. So we did ask the minister, and what the minister answered is that, in fact, he thought that there would be a rise in the number of asylum seekers. But what you're saying is that we can suspend it for 3 months and come back to the status quo afterwards. So I know that when it comes to accelerating the negotiations with the United States, well, perhaps suspending it for 3 months would work. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hanfield.
Up, Mr. Brunel Duceppe. We will now end our panel with Ms. Kwan. Ms. Kwan, you will have 5 minutes for your round of questioning. You can please begin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for their presentation. I'd like to just continue with Mr. Hanfield on this line of question. With respect to the Safe Third Country Agreement, some would argue that the United States is a safe country, and so therefore, the people who are trying to get to safety here in Canada is asylum shopping. And so I wonder what your response is to that, and what is the current state in the United States at the moment for asylum seekers?
Mais, en fait, comparer les deux systèmes.
So if you compare the two asylum-seeking systems is an error because Canada is far more open and far more flexible when it comes to the criteria for recognizing the refugee status. So, for example, sexual orientation, somebody who's seeking asylum on the United States who would say that they need the status because of their sexual identity, well, then they would not be able to use that as a reason for being granted refugee status. But in Canada, it is a criteria for granting refugee status. There's also groups that are criminalized in their country of origin. That's not recognized in the United States, but it is in Canada. Those are major differences. Detention as well. So here in Canada, it's exceptional to detain migrants, but with women, children, families do not get detained. But there may be centers for them that are particular, but in the United States, the migrants get sent to penal institutions where there are criminals, sometimes killers, etc. And so, really, in the federal government, and the Supreme Court had invalidated the agreement in 2020 because of these reasons, among others, because when people, because the United States was found to not be a safe third country for people who are concerned about being persecuted in their country of origin.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to turn to the representative from Mosaic, Ms. Nazakat. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. There's a lot of focus on Roxham Road, and of course, because of the volume of people crossing over irregularly. In British Columbia as well, we also have numbers. Do you have any sense of what is the state of impact on people crossing over irregularly in the British Columbia border?
Of course, thank you so much for asking that. Of course. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, when they cross the borders irregularly and they are not intercepted, they need to claim inland. And when they claim inland, the whole process of the refugee claim is way more difficult and longer because of the backlog we see with legal aid. It would take at times 1-2 months for a refugee claimant to be able to start working with their lawyers and put the claim in. And then it will take, again, some time to receive income assistance and delayed work permits for up to 18 months or more. And during this time, they do not really have any other financial resources. And the stress of not having a status, not receiving any results on their eligibility interview, the risk of being denied and found ineligible after more than a year of being in the country has a lot of pressure on refugee claimants. We receive refugee claimants every week in need of counseling services, one-on-one sessions for the trauma that they're going through, and they're stressed out. We're seeing families being separated because they cannot take the pressure any longer because of the uncertainty. So it has a toll on these refugee claimants.
Thank you. Does Mosaic receive any federal fundings to provide support to asylum seekers?
That's a very good question. So in the province of British Columbia, all the services directed to refugee claimants are only provincially funded. So there is only one federally funded program, which is called Reaching Home by IRCC, and it is only for some of the transitional houses. We do not have many transitional houses for refugee claimants in BC, and that is a small program. So I would say nearly all the funding is provided by the provincial government and not by IRCC.
So effectively, all of this pressure is offloaded to the province. We see that happening in Quebec as well. We see it in Manitoba. We see it in British Columbia. Would you say that the federal government, because immigration, after all, even if it's asylum seekers, is a federal issue, should the federal government be supporting provinces in trying to manage the situation and, of course, doing it in a compassionate and humanitarian basis?
Mm-hmm. I am not really sure what's the reason that the federal government is not funding refugee claimant services in BC. That's I think a question I do not have the knowledge of, but of course it would be. I would say,
sorry
yeah.
for interrupting, Madam Nazakat. Time is up for Ms. Kwan. And with that, our panel comes to an end. I really want to thank all the witnesses for appearing before the committee and providing important information. If there is something you would like to put it to committee's attention, you can always put it in writing and send it to the clerk of the committee, which will be in turn circulated to the members of the committee as we go through the finalization of the report. So with that, this panel comes to an end. And I thank all the witnesses. They can leave. For the members of the committee, please log off from this public meeting and then log in for the in-camera meeting so that we can have the committee business. So with that, the meeting is suspended. Members, please log in with the in-camera logins so that we can do the committee business. Thank you.
you.